Well, I want to wish you and your family a very happy Easter, you and your friends. Today is the day that we come together as the church to declare that the stone has been rolled away. And what a statement that is. If you have been coming, or if you showed up to this place today and you feel like you're not deserving or worthy to be in this place, you need to know that the stone has been rolled away. And because of that, you have complete and full access to the life-giving grace that God has to offer. It is yours, and you can receive that here this morning. Can someone say like an amen to that? Let's go. There we go. There we go. We're waking up. It's also on this morning that we get to say that life has conquered death. So when we encounter the darkness in the world, I don't know where you're at, but if you're experiencing a season of darkness in this time, in this place, it is God who pulls us out of that into the life-giving, radiating love of Christ. So that's what we get to do on Easter morning. We're going to start it off, I think, just like we should. Very simple. We're just going to read the story. And there's 4 different gospel accounts that you can read. You can read in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Today we're going to read the gospel account from Mark. And we're just going to read that. We'll get into it. So if you have your Bibles, you can follow along there. The words will be on the screen. But please hear these words from the gospel according to Mark. So when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, "Who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" When they looked up, they saw the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. So going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go, tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and you will see him there, just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, if you read the Gospel of Mark in your Bibles, you may get this note that there are these extra endings added later. But as far as scholars can tell, that is how the Gospel of Mark ended. That's the original ending. And this ending, it leaves a lot to be desired, doesn't it? It leaves so much to be desired because there's no actual encounter with the risen Jesus. I don't know if you caught that or not. Like, Jesus does not show up here. There's a promise of that he's going on ahead of them. All they get is, he isn't here, he has been raised. And it really doesn't end on a high note either. Think about what we come to do today. We come and we're feeling good. We're celebrating Easter. We sing a lot of songs that are filled with joy. It's high energy. There's excitement. But in this particular story, they didn't say anything. They're afraid. Did you catch this part that said they were overcome with terror and dread and they just fled from the tomb? That's not really the story I want to hear on Easter. I don't know about you. But it's the story we have. And as I enter into the story, I try to think about why is it that they were so afraid? What do they have to be afraid of? And as far as I can tell, it's because they were living into the assumptions that were given to them by the world. Now, you and I, we make a lot of assumptions in our lives. This is a normal thing that we do, and assumptions have this negative connotation associated with them. I don't really believe that assumptions are all bad. When we make an assumption, it's really based on our prior experience. So something happens to us, we learn from it, we grow, we change, we get better. We say, "Oh, I've seen that before," and an assumption helps us to kind of short circuit or take a shortcut and get to a resolution quicker. And they can be very helpful. For example, has anyone here ever burned themselves on a hot stove or taking something out of the oven? Yeah. How many have done that more than once? Oh, gosh, yeah. It's like I do that and I never learn, you know? But typically when you feel that burn on your hand or wherever it happens, then you make this assumption that I'm not going to do that again because that hurt. So you don't. In my house, we have a couple different assumptions. We have a lot, but here's a few of them. We have a dog, and this dog, it pains me to even tell you this and do this, but we have a dog that if the doorbell rings or there's a knocking sound like this, the dog is absolutely 100% sure to freak out and just go totally wild. We also have, like if we have candy in the house, if we have some sort of like cake or cookies, and they're sitting out, like you should have known better because those things are going to get eaten and not for the thing in which they were made for, the purpose for which they were created. So you got to hide it. You got to find a good hiding spot. And this can really get like brothers and sisters mad at each other. But we use assumptions all the time, and we use them for organizations that we're a part of. Just think about, like, if you're a part of a business, we use fancier words for assumptions, but we'll do this thing called a forecast, and we'll get all the data, and we'll crunch the numbers, and we'll use previous information to help us, like, forecast sales, to have a better understanding of what's coming up in the year ahead. Or we might use past expense data, spending data, so that we can tell, okay, what's our budget going to need to be like in the coming year? Right? We use that past data and we analyze it and we think about it. Now, what we do with our organizations is different than what we do in our normal life. In organizations, we spend time reflecting on and crunching those numbers because sometimes we have these assumptions going into it and the data reveals something different. Who's ever experienced something like that? We're like, oh, that's not what I thought it was. And what's it cause you to do? It causes you to change your direction or change your behavior based on what you learned. But you and I, we make assumptions in our everyday normal living, and it operates underneath the surface of our life, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. And when we make assumptions, you know that phrase, what happens when we make assumptions? When we make assumptions and we believe it to be true, oftentimes we end up living that out. So we believe that something is going to happen, and so we live in a way in which it becomes a reality. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak. So if you take like just two kids, and you say they have roughly the same amount of talent and skill and ability, and you pull one aside and you say, hey, I think you're really fast. That kid may actually begin to believe it, and they may internalize it. They're going to be a lot more motivated to run. They may even right there, they may look at you and say, you really think so? You really think so? And they'll say, watch this, and they run, you know. And you get to see them in that moment because they believe this message that you have assumed about them. And they'll become fast. You take another kid, again, of the same talent and ability, and you pull him aside or her aside, and you say, hey, you know this running stuff? I don't really think that's your thing. What's going to happen to that kid? That kid may subconsciously internalize it. They may start to believe it about themselves. They're gonna be self-conscious. And yes, it's more likely that they're not going to be motivated to run, and they will become, they won't run. They'll be slower than the kid that they're trying to race against because they don't believe it. And this makes sense on just like an anecdotal level in my life, and I'm sure yours too. You can think of people, name them in your head. Think of those people who have come into your life and they have said, oh my gosh, I believe this thing to be true about you. And they helped you see your potential, the potential that you have inside of you. They inspired you, and they believed in you, and you didn't even know that thing was possible. But they came to you and revealed that. I have several of those people. It takes a village. And then I've had people who have done the opposite, And I'm not talking like constructive criticism or helpful feedback, but there are people who have said things like, oh, I don't think you can do this. They've put these stones in your path. And it has prevented you from realizing your future possibilities. So assumptions, this is my point, they're not all bad. Sometimes assumptions can be a good thing. We just need to be aware of the assumptions that we are making because we make them all the time. And assumptions drive our behavior, okay? In this story, there are several assumptions that are made by the characters. You've got Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, or James, and then Salome, the mother of James and John. So Mary and Salome were mothers of disciples. And you have Mary Magdalene, who was a follower of Jesus. Now, we get really caught up on who were the 12 disciples, but these women were disciples of Christ. They don't maybe get credit for that original 12, but they were disciples of Jesus Christ. And you can see that in their faithfulness, and they're willing to show up at the tomb on that Easter morning. So they wake up, and they go to the grave, and they bring these spices with them. Because what they anticipate seeing is a dead body when they arrive. That's the assumption that they've been given. And of course they did. Of course they expected to see a dead body because they witnessed this death themselves. And it was the talk of the town. Everybody knew what was going on. They had seen it, and so they had prepared for it. Their behavior had told them, we need to bring these spices to go to Christ so that we can prepare his body in death. And they were going to have this one final moment with Jesus. That was an assumption that they made. Then on the way to the tomb, they had this conversation about a stone being in the way. So they asked themselves, who's going to roll this stone away for us? What are we going to do? They weren't strong enough to move the stone. And so they make this other assumption. The stone is going to be there. And they began to worry about it. What's going to happen when we show up? How are we going to get access to Jesus? We can't physically move this thing ourselves. And then there's these other assumptions that are all through the story, and it's for the people who aren't even there. One of them is named Peter. He is one of Jesus' disciples, and they tell the three women who showed up to go and tell him. But there's the other disciples as well. They didn't show up. And that's probably because they had the same exact assumptions as Mary, and Salome. Jesus has been died. We saw it. The stone has been put in the path in front of the tomb. There's no way we can get access to Jesus. So why even go? And if we go, someone's guarding the tomb. It's kind of a dangerous proposition. Look what they did to Jesus. They could potentially do the same thing to us. And they moved into a different space, I think. Their assumptions just caused them to give up. So if you're keeping score at home, here's what the assumptions that they lived out caused them to do. It caused them to expect the worst. It caused them to believe that they were going to face this resistance and worry. And then they were hopeless. There's a lot of hopelessness in this story. But like the characters on Easter, I don't blame them. I really do believe if I put myself in this story, like we would probably do a lot of the same things. And that the reason why that is because it just seems like it's part of life, doesn't it? Right? The world, it trains us. It trains us to believe through constant messaging and reinforcement that we are to expect the worst. So yes, death and destruction, that's just part of our life. We've come to know it and come to believe it. You turn on the news, right? What do you see? You see a lot of that negativity and also pain and death and destruction across the world. Furthermore, how about this? If you try to do something good in this world, doesn't it always feel like you're like pushing uphill against something? Like, does anyone notice what I'm trying to do? Is it making a difference? So we just kind of give up. We think it's not worth it. And over time, what happens if we live those assumptions, or if we believe in those assumptions, we end up living it out. And we make it a reality without even realizing it. So this week, I spent some time, this is wild because I just spent some time going through common assumptions we will make as people. And here's what it says. It was through this psychology website. It was like, here's our just common assumptions that we make. And as I went through them, I kind of realized that not only are these things unhelpful, they are untrue, and they adversely affect the way in which we live. So one of the things that we do is we tend to overgeneralize. And that looks like this. If you have ever made a mistake, you will say, well, I'm the worst in the world. You let one moment, one instance define all of you. And we do it to ourselves and we do it to other people, sometimes entire groups of people. Another thing that we'll do is we will catastrophize. We'll believe that something's actually worse than it really is. So maybe this event happens and we're just like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. How can it possibly get any worse? And then we're like, but we'll find a way to make it. Here's the possibilities that can make it any worse, and it will actually paralyze us from moving into action. And another one that they lifted up was hopelessness, where we just say all is lost, there is no use, nothing matters anymore. And so this is a really cynical place to live. We just kind of give up. And when we believe these assumptions about ourselves, it's usually because someone or something has told us to believe that. And if you're here today on Easter, the message of Easter tells us this. If you've been living under some of those assumptions, it's time to get a new assumption. If you are like the women at the tomb who arrived expecting resistance or arrived expecting the worst, what you encounter on Easter is a God who defies our expectations and moves us beyond conventional wisdom. The primary assumption that you and we should operate from on Easter is this, and you can say it with me. Hope is alive. Say that again. Hope is alive. And this is not just a hope where it's pretending like everything is okay, burying our heads in the sand. We can have hope because we're longing for something to happen that isn't yet realized. It's envisioning what can be and believing that it's possible. So when we have hope, it allows us to continue on the path to make it a reality. Do you see how that works? In this gospel story, they didn't encounter, I can't say this enough, they didn't encounter the risen Jesus. They did not see him. Does that sound familiar? How many of you have had this physical or even like deeply spiritual encounter with Jesus? Maybe you could name some moments. I've had a few of those maybe in my life, but that distance feels like a long time. I'm like, Jesus, come on, I need something. I'm waiting. But they didn't even see the risen Jesus, and yet they had hope. Why? Because he isn't there. He has been raised. So we know that hope is alive because Christ lives, we too can live. And it's not just about what God does through Jesus on that first Easter, that hope is alive. Hope is alive because the story continues on in you and I. We're invited into this thing, just like the women who were told, hey, go and tell other people. You and I carry hope in our hearts. When we leave this place today, we get to go out into the world and we get to proclaim in the darkest of places that hope is alive. And hope is alive because it lives on in you and me. Hope is alive because of those who dare to dream of a brighter future and are bold enough to share it. So here's what we're going to do today. You're going to help me finish the sermon out. All right? We're going to preach not at each other, but with each other. And I'm going to share a series of statements. And after I share that statement, you're going to say, hope is alive. And don't say it like, you want to say it triumphantly. Don't say it like, yeah, hope is alive. Like put something into it because you may be speaking this to yourself. You might find your story in some of these statements. But you're also going to be saying it to the people who are in this room that you know nothing about and you have no clue what's going on in their lives, but we're going to tell them anyway that hope is alive. We're going to do this together. So if you would join me in proclaiming that hope is alive to those who face roadblocks in life, hope is alive. To those who are facing an extended period of darkness, hope is alive. To those who have been told and believe they are a total failure, hope is alive. To those who can only envision a future where it continues to get worse, hope is alive. Don't go dying on me yet. Stay alive, people. Here we go. To those who feel ugly, disgraceful, worthless, or like they don't belong, hope is alive. To those who are unhoused and have no place to stay, hope is alive. To the victims of abuse who are suffering at the hands of another, hope is alive. To the outcasts and the oppressed,
hope is alive.
To those who are grieving the loss of a loved one, hope is alive. To those who are struggling with their mental or physical health, hope is alive. To those living in war-torn places, hope is alive. To those who are lonely, hope is alive. To those who are exhausted, hope is alive. To all who need it, hope is alive.